Our world has gone mad. If you could transport someone from the 1500s, say John Calvin, into the present with a time machine, he would be shocked at what he found. They don't know what a boy and a girl is? What happened? One thing that happened is that our world, apostatizing from the Christian faith, began to believe that the world was infinitely malleable, that we could do with it whatever we would, bend it into any shape we desired. We began to believe that we ourselves were gods, not the image bearers of God. In his book, The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self, Cultural Amnesia, Expressive Individualism, and the Road to Sexual Revolution, Carl Trueman explains these two fundamentally opposed ways of looking at the world as the mimetic and poetic views of the world. He explains, quote, "Put simply, these terms refer to two different ways of thinking about the world. A mimetic view regards the world as having a given order and meaning, and thus sees human beings as required to discover that meaning and conform themselves to it. Poesis, by way of contrast, sees the world as so much raw material out of which meaning and purpose can be created by the individual." In Romans 1:18-21, the Apostle Paul writes, "For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men, who by their unrighteousness suppress the truth. For what can be known about God is plain to them, because God has shown it to them. For his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world in the things that have been made. So they are without excuse. Though it is obvious to image-bearing humanity that God created all things, that creation itself has a givenness, a fixedness, a real and true way things are and ought to be, man in his sin nonetheless suppresses that knowledge in unrighteousness. This is why, in our culture, it is possible for a mother to use the courts to legally strip a father of his rights when he tries to prevent his child from being permitted to chemically transition from a boy to a girl. It's why we don't know what a man is, what a woman is. In today's episode, you'll hear part 2 of our discussion of the creed that underlies this ascendant, secular humanist worldview, the confession of faith confessed in the green groves and high places of our apostate culture. These green groves will have to go if we are to build our cathedral of Christendom. May this next hour you spend here in the King's Hall sharpen your axe and bring you to look to our brother Boniface, who knew what it was like to face down the green groves and high places of a pagan world, and what to do about it. The King's Hall podcast exists to make self-ruled men who rule well and win the world. What are some other implications of the belief that man is animal? Like, what else do you believe if you think that's true, and where does that show up in Western culture?
Yeah, I think one of the places that I've seen it is, so in the book, I'm not sure I would recommend it to a lot of people, but I think there's some insightful points here, but written by the Bronze Age pervert, so Bronze Age mindset. One of the things he talks about in there, he says, I think that evolution is patently false. And he said the reason is because man in an animalistic state is actually man at his worst. Like, man in pure survival mode he's not creating art, he's not creating culture. We used to know this. Like, you need leisure, you need a surplus of goods. People have to have time on their hands to create things that are beautiful. So really one of the problems is it fails to conceive of man at his best and what he really is. Really, I think Darwinism portrays like man at his best is man in the gulag. And you're like, that's actually a horrible place to evaluate what men are for.
Yep. You know what's really interesting is the gays try to justify homosexuality as a natural act because dolphins and whatever partake in homosexuality. And I always think immediately, like, you do not want to compare nature as like the standard of good and evil. No. I mean, like chimpanzees, they go to war and they rip testicles off of each other.
Well, think about
that's like their method, or like procreation, elk hunting, the biggest bull gets the biggest
winner take all.
harem. Yeah, it's winner take all. That's what. Thank you, Brian. You should have answered the question.
Well, I was thinking even at bears when we were in Canada and we were hunting. So what the boars will do is the boars will breed a sow, and as soon as she gives birth, they will rip the cub to shreds so that they can rebreed her.
Yeah, or they'll just rip cubs to shreds so that they can breed the female, whether they're their offspring or not.
So, doesn't even matter. So yeah, there's certainly a brutality there. And then you start to think about it, and you're like, well, is it really a good picture for humanity? But again, I keep drawing us back to pop culture. I guess that's where my mind is today. But I'm thinking of things like when I was a kid, it was popular, like the Bloodhound Gang. you and me, baby, we ain't nothing but mammals, so let's do it like they do on the Discovery Channel. So, like, even this concept that, like, human sexuality is going to be defined based on what we see in the animal kingdom, you're going to get a pretty brutal, perverted thing.
That's the problem with an evolutionary worldview. The implications of this belief that man is animal is that all of a sudden, every moral ought goes out the window. You can now no longer say man ought to be like this and not like this. Because who cares? If you can do it, you can do it. Like nature, brute nature is brutal nature. Might makes right. It's a domain where might makes right. And so if you can do it, there is no good or bad. If you want to do it, you do it. You just, if you would like to be, to rape as many women as possible, who can tell you? They can say they don't like it. Like they can give you their psychological reaction to it. I don't like that. But they can't tell you, you really shouldn't do that. You can say, why? Chimpanzees do it.
Yeah, and I would actually
do it.
I would actually argue that evolutionary theory is inherently incompatible with morality at all.
At all. There is no such thing. It's just a human construct. Yeah.
And it's old, but you would always say to people, when I was in college, we did classical philosophy, and the professors would say things to you like, well, morality is just a reflection of taste, like what I like and what I don't like.
Yeah.
And I said, cool, I'm stealing your car. And he'd say, well, you can't do that. Well, why?
Well, I could, though.
I could actually do it.
You
why
don't work out. You're a professor. I mean, I could take you.
I could take you. And they're really appealing to a morality that obviously has to come outside of evolutionary theory.
Well, you see why these ideals are attractive to one another, because you have this evolutionary mindset, and then you say these constructs are society imposing their ideals onto me, which is really restricting my libertarian freedom apart from God, the made-up sky fairy that you believe in anyway. And so they're really friends. And they all, again, come down to there is no God.
Yeah.
I'm my own God.
Yeah.
Yeah, you don't have to render unto God what is God's.
No, because
if you say there
God's.
is no God and nothing belongs to him, and as we'll see with kind of like each one of these individuals that we analyze and in future episodes, most all of them tend to be pretty perverted individuals. Nietzsche kills himself. Freud is like a sexualized freak.
Rousseau abandons his children to orphanages where the death rate was 95%. Several of his children, after writing a book on parenting. Absolutely unreal. The guy was
No, it was real. He really did that.
He did. He was a very bad man.
Yeah.
Very, very bad man. So, you start to see, though, each of these build, and they culminate. We've already told you the punchline. They culminate in the final one, that man is God. And you see how it's like this works. Man is good. Well, now man is an animal, and so he's an evolving animal. He's ever-changing. He's unfixed. And so you can now become something. Your nature can change. The good nature that you have, it's plastic. You can mold it however you want. And so, you start to see how we can get to this idea that from that, eventually it's like, okay, so I don't render to God what is God's because there is no God, but then actually I am God, and so render to me. And I can do that because if might makes right. If I have the power, if I'm the biggest male in the herd, if I'm the smartest, it's winner take all. There's no more Christian morality where you do to your neighbor as you'd have done by. No, it's like all of that becomes fairy tale, and it becomes, dead by the wayside. So let's move to the third one, because there's another layer to this that we've already begun to move into. And we're going to talk about Freud a little bit more now and his utter sexual and perverse psychological insanity. And this is the third entry in the confession. Not only is man good, not only is man an animal, but man is fundamentally a sexual animal. Man is fundamentally a sexual animal.
This is what the Bloodhound Gang was trying to say, Brian.
Yeah, exactly. We're deeply shaped as a culture by this idea that man is an animal. But one thing you discover very quickly in our modern cultural religious landscape is an utter obsession with sex. Everything is sex. Everything is sexualized. I mean, so do you agree? Where do we see this? Where did this come from? Those are my questions.
Yeah, I think everything is sexualized. Rates, you can look at a lot of statistics, rates of porn use, astronomical. Everywhere you look online, even when you're trying to hide stuff, it's like you can't help but be bombarded by sexual content. It's at the end of articles. It's on Facebook. It's in Twitter. It's absolutely everywhere you look. The irony, and this is sort of like jumping to the punchline. But the irony in all this for me is, as I counsel young men especially, we have greater levels of sexual impotence than ever in like 20-year-olds.
Yeah.
So it's actually doing something to us where we're obsessed with sex, but we've come to hate sex. And I think it's sort of like in the book of Isaiah, Israel turns to her whore lover, and then immediately what happens is you detest your whore lover. So it's like the idol you make of sex, you immediately begin to hate it because you realize that it's bondage and slavery.
Yeah, it doesn't deliver.
It doesn't deliver. It's absolutely horrible. So now you have like, even among married people, you have like people are having less sex than ever, even though and I think it's because we're trading on sex at every corner. Like, and what I mean is advertising. Every ad is like this hyper super sexualized.
Buy this lip balm because of breasts.
Yeah, I mean, you're watching like shampoo commercials, and it's like, just like this erotic shower scene with an individual, and you're like, I just want shampoo, man.
Why are they climaxing?
Yeah, I don't understand why this is happening.
Right? Like it is insane.
Yeah, Axe body spray. So
yeah,
I feel like it's just one of those things that it's so steeped in the culture and in society. Like you're watching like little kids Disney, and there's got to be sexual innuendo. It's absolutely everywhere.
Yeah, I think that's definitely been the case for quite a while now, especially with the advent of screens.
Yeah,
of visual entertainment would be.
Yeah, you no longer have to chisel a naked person on a clay tablet or whatever. You know?
It's like, wow, that's a hottie in marble right there.
It took me 6 years.
And so, if you had asked me this question 10 years ago, I would probably have a similar answer to what you had said, Eric. Some crazy things have happened recently to where even the person's identity, and I know this is kind of mixing our categories a little bit more, but the person has to be identified with sex. It's not just an activity that you participate in and that you enjoy. It is something that you actually have to be like, is a part of your personhood.
Yeah.
It's a part of your identity. That's why I mean, when DeSantis says like, teachers, you can't talk to kids about sex. And the ages was like 3rd grade and under. I'm like, what? What about the older ones? Like, what? And then I'm like, who's going to be mad about this? And teachers are like really upset that they can't share their gay escapades with their kindergarten class.
Their gay escapades.
Who says I'm gay?
You are gay.
They need approval for their identity that is associated with sex. To me, this is absolutely crazy.
Yeah, this is the move. It's man is not just an animal, but man is an animal at the heart of which is sex. The heart of what identifies you in your personhood is sex. And this idea, I think, we've already mentioned it, but this really deeply goes back to Freud. People don't understand, I think, the degree to which Freud and his ideas became mainstream and turned the public narrative towards this, right? A lot of Freud's ideas have been, no psychologist today is like, yeah, Freud was right about his basic psychological theories. They pretty much don't agree with him. They've debunked his stuff. They're like, he's not true. But the ideas, nonetheless, got into the mainstream pop culture zeitgeist, and they're absolutely durable. He basically, in his psychoanalysis, he summed up the entirety of human fulfillment, the entirety of happiness, the entirety of human identity around sex, even to the point where he basically said, this is what human fulfillment is: genital pleasure. Yeah. Right? Let's talk about the stages that he came up with, the kids.
Yeah, it's interesting. Even before you jump into that, it's interesting. The early feminists actually, Betty Friedan she hated Sigmund Freud.
Oh, yeah.
And it's interesting because Sigmund Freud was very misogynistic. And we'll see, I think, as we unpack these, why basically like a woman is like a sexual object for male satisfaction.
Yeah, even his mother.
Yeah, even his mother.
Even your mother.
Yeah, so what's interesting, and dovetailing into it, Dan, you can unpack these more, but even things that we have like oral fixation. So when I remember being on a job site one time, and I was always chewing on a sucker or sunflower seeds. And a guy said to me, he goes, "Oh, you have an oral fixation."
Oh, gosh.
What the heck is an
That's
oral
Mista?
fixation? Mista?
Mista, what?
This is actually when Dan was talking, this is all I could think about.
What's wrong with you people?
That's right.
It's R.C. Sproul. What's wrong with you people? But yeah, oral fixation, the anal phase.
Oh,
yeah. So the phases of human development, he defined as the oral phase, which is like breastfeeding, the anal phase, which is when a child learns control in order to control bowel movements. And then it's the phallic stage, which is typically in your teen years when there's a lot of self-pleasure. I don't know if there are kids listening.
Yeah.
And then the last stage, I can't remember what he called it.
Yeah,
it was at the
I
it was the genital pleasure stage.
Yeah, I can't remember.
Which is essentially like you move from self-pleasure to desiring full-on relational, intimacy with another person.
You can see all of this is like your whole existence as a human is defined by sexuality.
Well, yeah. So he
Everything.
even infants, he said, had a sexual desire.
Yeah, they were and that was the point.
Yeah, breastfeeding was
expressing
a
it.
sexual desire.
You were channeling your sexual self through the mouth in the oral stage.
I'm actually jealous of my nursing son. If that's true,
yeah,
I'm going to go like bear.
Some of the ideas,
like a bear on him. No, I'm just kidding. I'm not.
Some of the ideas that come from this, like if that's true, it's fun. It's absurd. I mean, but if that's true, then fathers should feel like they're in competition sexually with their nursing child. That's the gayest thing I've.
Yeah, I mean, there is competition, but not in that way. It's more like of time.
Right. It's not.
Yeah.
Not quite
Leave my woman alone.
The interesting thing too is like even Carl Jung, you see it Jung. Even Carl Jung back then, like he's pretty contemporary to Freud.
Yeah.
Was like, this guy's a nut job.
Oh yeah, they were like, no. And then Jung was like, and let me come up with even nuttier view of the world. Yeah. With like the what does he say? Like the collective unconscious that we all tap into.
He's more about like the archetypes and stuff like that.
Sorry, Jordan Peterson.
Yeah, you see a lot in Jordan Peterson. One of the questions I want to ask about this is, as it infiltrates into culture, have you seen the church respond to it in a positive way? Or do you think the church has been complicit in some of this?
What do you mean in a positive way?
Well, like, did they respond to it
right?
In a way
like, did they rise to the occasion?
Yes.
Yeah. Or did they go along with it? I think one of the condemning facts that you have is that the amount of pornography use there is in the church is that, no, we didn't really answer this question well, I think. And we kind of went along with it to where you even see, like, think about the way that this is actually all the way back to some of our big, fast, and famous and megachurchianity sort of stuff, is that in a lot of ways, the church adopted some of the marketing sexual playbook of this culture.
Yes. I recall going to a megachurch when I lived in the Midwest, and the worship leader was like probably a 9 lady, who was singing with smoke machines and lights. Like, she was dressed, I would say, like very inappropriately. And then the pastor is like some like jacked, good looking guy.
Always talking about his hot wife.
I don't know about that. I only went once, and I was like, not for me.
These guys are always talking about, they're like, yeah, my hot wife.
Well, you can also look at the fruit that the church has produced. Like, how many stories have we heard from, this is not empirical, this is just, our experience, but in youth group, like, how many times have there been romantic dramas or issues in youth group, or within the church, like you said, the prevalent use of pornography? But the fact is, the fruit that the church is producing by allowing their kids to go to public schools where they're highly sexualized. I mean, the things that I learned on the school bus. Anyway,
unbelievable.
And
there weren't even furries on your school bus.
No.
There are now.
Yes, there
Not
are,
in
Eric.
Dan's school bus.
Do you like furries?
Oh, that's true. Dan actually owns a school bus.
I own a school bus.
I'm sorry.
I own a school bus, yep.
I'm not accusing you of
that. Doesn't
weird.
have a website. I've plugged everything, but that does not have a website. And I would say follow me on Instagram, but I hate Instagram. So.
That's right.
Speaking of sex.
Yeah.
I mean, Instagram is basically like a sex cesspool. For the project of this season to be successful, the project of seeing a new Christendom built, there will need to be thousands and thousands of Christian men and women who are equipped to stand for the truth of Scripture against the errors of both the liberal church and the pagan culture. This is one reason we're so glad to be partnering with our sponsor for this season, Reformation Heritage Books. Reformation Heritage Books offers a large selection of helpful and theologically rigorous resources on everything from biblical theology to history to blue-collar family discipleship, the type of library and resources that could make the kind of men and women I just described, grounded in the rich heritage of the Reformed faith. We'd like to highlight one resource in particular, their Family Worship Bible Guide, that presents Rich devotional thoughts on all 1,189 chapters of the Bible, including searching questions to promote conversation and to help you in leading your family in such a way as to say with Joshua, "As for me and my house, we will serve the Lord." Tap the link in the description of this episode to pick one up today.
Yeah, I was thinking as you guys were talking about this, not about Instagram and the rest of that, but I was thinking about, did the church answer the question well? Well, did the sexuality that the church portrayed in the last 100 years, was it powerful to combat this? And that's why I would say no. No, in fact, we followed feminism. We followed, so much of I was even thinking of like Ed Young Jr. I remember this is probably 10 years ago, but he had like a sermon series and he was on like, Good Morning America.
Yeah, I remember this.
It was all about like, sex in married couples, but it was done like really kind of crass and weird.
Didn't he go on the roof of his church for a week in bed with his wife?
There's some weirdness to it. Yeah, that's what I mean.
Like the marketing campaign was like they put their bed on the roof of the church.
Yeah,
well, you can even see this with like Revoice or the gay movement within the church. Even just saying like, I'll identify you as a gay Christian, as long as you don't whatever made up boundaries that you're going to put into it. But inviting that into the church.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I think even in past culture, like in the 70s and 80s, you tended to see a lot of conservatives would say things like, well, what you do in your bedroom, like, that's your sex act, but that's not like who you are, and I don't want to know about it. It wasn't as much of like, we had this concept introduced that was gender identity.
Yep.
So this ties into it too. Beyond the sex stuff, though, I would say with Freud, it's like, okay, self-esteem, the whole self, categories that we come up with. I think that's why Rachel Jankovic had to write a book like Yoo-Hoo.
Yoo-Hoo, yeah.
Because that's dominant in women's circles. Like, girl. Girl, wash your face. Like, you're strong and sexy. And it's just like, what is this?
Yeah. Let's actually tie this into the next two entries in the statement of faith, because they go together and they're the natural development of what we're talking about. So we've got man is good. The man is an animal. Now man is a sexual animal. So we're looking into ourselves for the ideal standard of good, our psychological selves, which we now see are, obsessively sexual selves. And now we get to number 4, that this confession of faith would confess that man's chief end is not to glorify God and to enjoy him forever, like the Westminster Shorter Catechism would say, but that man's chief end is to discover his inner psychological and sexual self and to express that inner psychological sexual self. So man can't just be himself. It's not enough to just be yourself. You actually have to be accepted as your authentic inner self and affirmed by society in that inner psychological and sexual self. So our culture has basically, like you were talking about conservatives that say, yeah, what you do in your bedroom is your business, whatever, so long as it doesn't hurt me. How is gay marriage going to hurt you, conservatives? Ha, 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 ha. Well, our culture's utterly rejected this model of society where everyone can do their own thing so long as you don't hurt anyone else. So that's not enough now. It's not enough to just say, like, he can be gay as long as I can be straight and Christian. You be you, I'll be me, whatever. No, you have to bake the cake celebrating gayness. What happens if you keep acting like you're living in a culture? This is my question. What happens if you keep acting like you're living in a culture that is fine with letting bygones be bygones, rather than a culture we actually live in, where you must go beyond that, from tolerance into celebration and acceptance?
Yeah, that's really a really interesting question. And I think Ayn Rand in Atlas Shrugged, that was one of the core themes in her book. And granted, that book has massive problems. I got to the end, I was so disappointed. Anyway, that's a different conversation for a different day.
Also long.
Also a long book. I like the long books. Anyway, so one of the themes in the book is that you have these like Hank Rearden is this steel mogul. He makes this new steel. It's called Rearden metal. And it's better than steel in every way, whatever. So he makes this steel, and it's not fair that he's not sharing. It's a winner take all. He has this more conservative mentality, and he won't conform to the ideals of society, which is essentially that it isn't fair that you're winning.
Yeah, right.
And so you need to share with everybody. And so he said no. Essentially, he said no. And there are a few characters that do this, and his advice is don't capitulate, don't accept their terms.
Yeah.
even for a moment, because they don't want you to just do the thing. They don't want you to just make the cake. They want you to love making the cake for the gays.
That's right.
And they will make you do it any way they can, through coercion, through force.
I'll destroy you.
Even with guns. Again, I'll after hours, we're going to talk about this. So I'll push that again. But they want you to actually love the things that they love. They want you to do the things with zeal.
Yeah, and I would even say on a pragmatic side of things, Dan, is it's so much easier if we push back now. Like if so the problem now is we've been playing this game for 20 years with the LGBT crowd.
Yes.
And I think a lot of people thought, well, like you remember the military for a long time when I was a kid, it was Bill Clinton and don't ask, don't tell.
Yeah, just don't ask, don't tell. You can be gay, but just don't tell anybody.
Yeah, it's no big deal. Do your thing. Don't make it a big deal. And there were a lot of people who were like, who said to like Doug Wilson, no, you're playing the slippery slope fallacy. Right. Well, Doug was right. And here we are today. So I think that's number one, I would say, is, okay, practically you have to push back against this stuff. We know the trajectory now where all of this is going. But the other thing is, I think that what's happened is a lot of people have learned how to trade on their sexual identities, meaning like you actually have more cultural capital. This is why you have like 12-year-olds who are like, I'm a bisexual. Because even a kid who doesn't know anything about sex has figured out that, okay, well, if I say that I'm a bisexual and I'm transgender, immediately I'll get special treatment.
Right. People pay attention.
Yeah,
So I move up the rung of cultural capital. Like I'm more important. I have a little bit more power, whatever.
Yeah.
Whereas if you go to school today and you're like, I'm a cisgendered heterosexual male, people are like, pig.
Social credit deducted.
Yeah, that's right. It's not that both sides can equally just be themselves. It's that as a Christian, you are actually affirming something that, if it were true, would mean that they are an abomination.
Yes.
They can't coexist. This neutral world idea is a total lie. We live in a negative world where you have, a culture where unless you will move past mere toleration into celebration, then you are actively hating them. Why? Because you are denying what is at the heart of their personhood.
Well, can I ask a question then?
Yeah.
If that's true, does it alarm you that so many pastors, Christian pastors with huge platforms, are loved by the New York Times?
Absolutely. That should, like, when you can get to a point like J.D. Greer, where you start to say things from the pulpit, like you've mentioned before, the Bible whispers about sexual sin, but it shouts about, what did he say, religious hypocrisy or something? I can't remember.
Yeah. Or even this week, Tim Keller wrote an op-ed in the New York Times that they ran about how Christians should engage the culture. And I'm thinking to myself, if you're a faithful Christian in this cultural context, and you, like if you turned in your article for the New York Times, they would burn it.
Yeah, when the enemy is posting, we'll accept that playbook.
Oh boy.
I mean, Dan, shouldn't that concern us?
Yeah. I mean, it would be like the Denver Broncos giving the Green Bay Packers their playbook, and the Packers are like, "Oh yeah, I believe this absolutely."
Yeah, it's a great playbook.
It's a great playbook.
They're like, "Please play like this."
Yeah, play like this.
We will beat you.
We accept this. This is amazing.
Yeah,
that's a really good illustration. Yeah, you're like, "Hey, this is our game plan," and they're like, "Oh, we can beat that.
We love that.
We can beat the snot
Actually, we're
out
going
of
to tell everybody that's your game plan."
That's right. That's right. We're going to put this guy in at QB, and they're like, "Oh, yes, please do." Like Tim Keller's our quarterback. Oh yeah, we love that. We love that guy. He's got ballerinas in communion.
Oh, he does.
He's got male ballerinas in tights doing communion dancing.
That's so
and because David danced before the Lord, Dan.
Yeah, Tim would actually, he's espoused for a long time, like using gays and homosexuals to lead in worship.
Is that where Bethel came from? I'm sorry.
Yes.
We'll cut that out. Oh man. So
no, we won't.
We're not.
No, we won't.
We're
not cutting it out. So we're talking about this move in the confession of faith of these demonic ideologies that has successfully catechized the culture to believe that the most important thing about themselves is their sexual identity. That's at the center of what they are. And their chief end, the thing that they need to be able to do above all else, is to express that sexual inner self to the world.
Well, and be accepted by it.
And to be loved and adored and worshipped.
Worshipped.
And to be worshipped.
Yes.
This is why, and what's funny is a lot of how this is working out culturally is unprecedented. Like, let's be honest about that. The way that the industrial and technological and information revolutions have changed screens, like you mentioned. But at the same time, go back 2,500 years, go back 3,000 years. What do you find? You find fertility cults. You find, little clay idol gods that have 16 breasts and they're like some highly sexualized woman. It is extremely tempting. As soon as you dethrone God as God and man as image bearer of God, one of the most tempting things to make an idol is human sexuality, because it's like, it's so powerful. You get more people, like we reproduce through sexuality. You can literally replicate yourself with this act. It is pleasurable in a concentrated way. Your entire biological development seems to be, as apparently, pointed at bringing you to sexual maturity. You could see how this would be powerful. But what's happened today is that we've created this potent narcotic, spiritually potent narcotic, where you combine that ancient fertility cult ideas, which is not new, with the unprecedented ability to self-expression, immediate self-expression in social media, and, all of the cultural, technological changes that have happened. So, I mean, do you guys see, like, why is this moment so much that has become so intensified? That ancient sex worship has become intensified. Is that what's underneath it? Is it technology? Is it some of these other ideas? What do you guys think about that?
Yeah, I think at the heart of it, you see such an erosion of Western culture that it's almost pre-Western in some ways. That's why you're seeing like fertility cults.
That's interesting.
But it's not really a fertility cult. It's more of like the Molech cult.
Yeah.
Sexual deviance.
So it's like late
things
Roman
like
Empire.
That. It's I mean, that's the only way I can think about it.
Yeah.
I'm sure somebody else has greater insights on that. But it almost reminds me of, like, as I'm almost done with the book that Herodotus wrote, Histories, it reminds me of a lot of those ancient Greek societies. Like a lot of the things that they did, where there is just absolutely heinous and wicked things that people are doing and celebrating. And so it almost smells to me like like a post-Western, pre-Western, a non-Christian influenced people.
Interesting.
And even in Carl Trueman's book, he talks about certain cultures being a first world, second world, third world culture.
Reef? Isn't it the writing of?
Yeah, I can't remember.
Who came up with that term?
Yeah, I can't remember the reference, but essentially you have this first world culture that is ruled by the metaphysical, a god with the laws and the priests over this divine being with sacred texts. A second world culture being those that are removed from that, but are still strongly influenced by it, where social norms are still constructed around the metaphysical. And then you have a third world culture where it is completely denied the metaphysical in that way.
Yeah.
And so the third world culture is incompatible with the first and second world, because the foundations of how they reason and the foundations of truth, what is true, what is good and beautiful, is completely debased. It is completely different. I thought that was a really apt description in his book, that we are actually living in a third world culture. That's why it's impossible to have conversations with these people, because they are completely unmoored from the metaphysical, from the God who created us. And so we're operating on a different presupposition. I mean, that is like radically different. And so that's why I say almost like a pre-Western society, like it's just pagans, not influenced by Christianity.
Yeah.
But in some ways it's almost worse, because it's also reactionary to the past, to where the past is something that needs to be shed off.
You'll end up, I think, one of the interesting points, I looked it up, American sociologist Philip Reef Truman in his book talks about this.
Him.
First worlds are pagan worlds. Moral codes are based on myths. Second worlds are based on their faith in God, monotheistic Christian God. Okay. And then the third world, they don't root their morality or code in anything sacred. It's all self-referential. It's my. And so what's interesting though, and I hadn't thought about it until you said this, it seems like because Philip Reef calls that third world a death work. Or an anti-culture.
Yeah, you're right. Yeah.
An anti-culture. Because what it does is it actually can't create anything. Because it's self-referential. It's just masturbatory. It's circular. It's relativistic. It's ultimately
I was avoiding using that word earlier, by the way.
Yeah, right.
Circular.
So yeah, that one.
Circular. But what's interesting is that, and I think we're seeing this shift, is that the third world will eventually kill itself and lead back to the first world, to where you'll end up with a rise of new pagan gods. Because you'll end up deifying homo adorans. You'll end up worshiping something and deifying something. And what they're doing is they're just bringing back Molech. They're just bringing back Ashtoreth. Freud, what is Freud but a big Asherah pole, right? Asherah poles were like penis-shaped.
That's a big phallus.
Big phallic symbols that they would worship as fertility gods. What is Freud but really dressed up, intellectual, pseudo-intellectual, I would say, Asherah poles.
Yeah, it really is
Everything
true.
is a penis.
It reminds me even of the G.K. Chesterton quote, right? Wherever there is animal worship, there will be human sacrifice. Again, like you're not creating anything new in your worship.
Yeah.
You're just repeating old patterns. And I think it's wise for Christians, too, to look at this state and say, look, okay, first of all, the culture has become what they worshipped.
Yep.
You wanted to be this animal-like, beast-like, sex, crazed thing, and that's what you became.
They gave their amen.
Yeah, and so that's what they became. But I think for Christians, this is where we go wrong, I think, is we look at all of that, and then we say, okay, so the world is damned. Let's pray for Christ to come back at any minute. And really what we should be looking at is like a farmer and going like, yeah, the forest just burned, but I'm telling you, in 5 minutes, it's going to be the most lush, fertile hillside on the planet.
Yes. Christendom grew out of the fertile
Yes.
decomposition of the Roman Empire.
And we're truly not, you read history, we are not worse than it's ever been.
No, we're technologically advanced. We have big populations, but we're the same. We're the same. Adding another layer to this, another wrinkle to this. If you believe all of this, if you adopt these first 4 statements of faith, man's chief end then is to discover his inner psychological sexual self and then express it, and everyone must worship me and receive me and accept me and celebrate me. Well, then inevitably you'll end up confessing the 5th thing, which is that man's problems are medical and psychological. You see, we're starting to come full circle, right? Like, oh, man's problems are societal. Well, in Rousseau, man is basically good, so it must be society's fault. Well, then as we get into man as this sexual, psychological animal, it's like, well, then where are your problems going to come from? Sure, we'll talk about society and Marx and some of those, ideas that flourished as well, statism. But you also say, and I think you see this in transgenderism, you see this in a lot of these death work cultures, is that man's problem basically then can be solved through therapy and medical technology and technology in general.
Yeah, I think, so have we made an idol of medicine?
Oh, right.
The cult of Fauci, the cult of everything that happened in the last couple of years, I think it wasn't that we didn't have medical idolatry beforehand. It was that was the exposing apocalypse.
Yeah.
But you look back on it, and man, to this day, like the number of lies that were told, the number of lies that were whitewashed under, but experts now say. And I think really what it was realizing is that we've been led astray by the God of, think about how many antidepressants. I was reading this week, and you're talking about, okay, why is there so much estrogen in the water? And it's because we're flushing the pill, and the pill is in our urine, like the birth control pill.
Yeah.
And so it's contaminating the water. And I tweeted this earlier, but I said, it's like Moses and the gold, right? He grinds it up, puts it in the water, and he says, you're going to drink the judgment of God. You want to make an idol? You drink it.
He makes them drink their God.
And I said,
pee it out.
You know what's crazy is here we are, literally here we are, and God is judging America by saying, you want to control your fertility through these synthetic hormones? Really?
Go ahead.
You want to do that? Why don't you drink the judgment?
Eric, this was one of your greatest tweets of all time.
Thank you.
I hit the retweet so hard, and so I saw it and I was like, retweet. I want my followers to see this, because it was like, and I was preparing the outline for this episode when you tweeted.
So we were on the same wavelength.
And I wrote down for a while Eric's tweet, and then I ended up working it in.
And here's the interesting thing. So just like in COVID, what was the immediate thing that happened on my tweet thread? Well, that article is not by a trusted expert. And I was like, are you kidding? Are you kidding? Like you
Pound sand.
You think I
Pound
care
sand.
what the trusted experts have to say here?
It's like the meme. Do you have any research on that? And it's the Chad guy, and he's like, I made it up. Because this is true too. Like when you see medicine as like, okay, we're animals, and so we have physical problems. We're psychological creatures. We're this inner self, this inner psychological sexual self, and so we have therapeutic problems that we need the answer to. And all of a sudden, the Savior, the Messiah, does become medicine. It becomes transhumanism, chemical transhumanism in what is the birth control pill but chemical transhumanism. It's improving and transcending your physical limitations with chemical alteration. It's just Elon Musk's Neuralink, but in a pill form.
Chemical castration.
There are some eunuchs who were
abortifacient.
made eunuchs by men, and there were some eunuchs who were born eunuchs, and there were some eunuchs that popped a pill. It's like, this is such a perfect illustration of the way that this death work pagan culture of ours fundamentally believes that it doesn't believe sin is the problem. It believes that medical problems are the problem. And now I can use technology and I can make my outer self match that inner self.
It sort of reminds me, Dan, in a maybe to use a blue collar analogy here, because that's sort of how my mind works sometimes. But a lot of times when you create a problem, when you try to fix a problem with something else, right? So
My brother says fix it till it's broke.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Fix it till it's broke.
And he does.
He does.
But you carry this into the medical, and so what we've done is we've created a problem, like the pill. We create a problem, and then we got to introduce a new drug to create the problem. But again, to Brian's point, it's all about this, like, well, the real issue is your chemical imbalance.
Oh, yeah.
It's not your habits. It's not your lack of discipline. It's not the
Right.
fact you're a glutton. It's not the fact that you're cheating on your wife. It's not the fact that you're lazy at work.
Yeah.
Or you have no meaningful mission in your life. No, it's just a chemical imbalance.
Yeah.
So we'll give you another chemical to straighten out the imbalance. By the way, Jordan Peterson, good example, that chemical that we gave you might drive you crazy and make you want to kill yourself.
SSRIs, yes. And transgenderism, another perfect example. We've created a problem through our idolatry of believing that this intersexual self is like the sum of who I am. And then, of course, you're just going to, like, when a 10-year-old first discovers pornography, a topless woman gives him, like, a high. But then he has to keep looking for increasingly hardcore, more hardcore, crazier, more perverted, until pretty soon you've got 14-year-olds who are watching bestiality pornography. Like, this is a real thing. And it's the same thing with this sexual self. Well, we started with, like, Playboy and Hugh Hefner and pornography culture. And now, 30, 40, 50, 60 years down the road, what are we doing? We're chopping people's genitalia off, and we're trying to medically transmogrify them into some fake, crazy, queened gender fake version of themselves with our medical technology and chemical intervention. It's like the Nazi medical experiments, but just mainstreamed on CNN.
We just make those look like child's play.
Oh, yeah. We're like, oh, you Mengele, you thought you could mangle people? Well, just watch. We'll do it to 12-year-olds.
What's interesting to me, and I don't want to go too far down the rabbit trail.
We're so kicked off of Apple Podcast.
We're so
I mean,
off.
like,
But even things like the way that judgment comes around on this, Dan, where it's like, we take the pill, we think we're so smart, this is really great. Oh, it's really weird when all of our women are dying of breast cancer all of a sudden.
Yeah, or you can't have kids.
Yeah, I can't have kids. We were talking about this in the masculinity space. Somebody pointed this out. It's not in a lot of the literature, but like TRT, testosterone replacement therapy, they were like, oh, yeah, by the way, it makes you sterile.
wow.
Yeah, it makes you almost completely sterile.
Unbelievable.
So it's like, okay, can we just stop with injecting yourself with things that are synthetic?
Or like the mother it was on Reddit or something. I think it went around Twitter. The mother was talking about they were talking about basically, I did everything right with my trans son. Or it was really a daughter that he was transforming. Or it was a son he was trying to transform into a daughter. It's like, we gave him the hormone blockers, and now he's 18, and we want to give him the full transition bottom surgery, as they call it, where they cut his penis off and make a fake vagina.
Sorry, parents, if you had kids in the room.
Yeah, it's okay. You're gonna want to instruct your kids on these things anyway. So,
Good opportunity.
yeah, good opportunity.
Disney's doing it anyway.
But he was like, oh, because of the chemical castration, that's not how they put it, he has a micro penis and no sexual desire whatsoever. Because they interrupted his puberty. They permanently deferred it so that now they can't even make a fake female genital system or whatever, because usually they use the pleasure sensors of the man's penis to make the fake vagina. Man. So this adult man is now permanently disfigured, has permanently, it's a perfect example of judgment. Claiming to be wise, they became fools. In search of the perfect expression of their intersexual self, they made all sexual expression impossible. They made this person a eunuch. They made them asexual. So now that they can't even have sexual desires because they have completely chemically destroyed them. This is why, you guys, when we're talking about Christendom, and the mission of God, and bringing the gospel of the kingdom of God into conflict with this culture of death. This is not just like side issue culture warring. It makes me so angry when these radical two kingdoms guys are like, oh yeah, the gay stuff, that's all cultural. Quit your culture warring. I'm like, they are destroying God's image bearers, and they are worshiping demons.
Well, not only
enslaved.
that, but it's also infiltrated the church.
Yeah.
Because then, so I'll start really mild. If you were to say, like, Christians, you need to have kids. You should have a lot of kids. You should have kids. And then you get people that are like, well, hold on a minute. You know, you shouldn't be, that's legalism.
Yeah.
You shouldn't be telling how many, people to have how many kids and whatever. And like, okay, all right, yeah. There is a line there somewhere. But no, you should have kids. Don't despise the blessing. It's just insane to me. Like to not want to have children, to not actually bear fruit.
Yeah.
Other places that this has infiltrated the church, unless you had something more on that.
Well,
point.
I was going to say, it's a perfect example of how in search of fulfillment, they actually cut themselves off from blessing.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. One of the discussions that I frequently have with younger couples, they're talking about having children. They say, I don't know if we should have kids or not. We should wait or whatever. And one of the things that I bring up amongst a whole lot of other things, just for the sake of brevity, is that one of the most severe curses that God gives is to cut off someone's line. He will say, I'm going to judge you. I'm going to curse you. I am killing you and your descendants. You're done.
Yep.
Like they're all dead.
There will be no more Edomites.
There are no more. They're gone. And you do that to yourself. You are cursing yourself with one of the greatest curses that God has in his tool belt, is to end your line. And so that's what this chemical castration does. That's what Christians are doing with intentional childlessness. That's what they're doing when you actually take birth control pills and you make the womb an inhospitable place for a baby to grow. It's an abortifacient. It can cause abortions. Anyway, so it should be no surprise that women that take birth control pills for a long, long, long time, and then when they're 40, they want to have a kid, they can't. So it shouldn't surprise us.
It's really interesting, and this is a discussion that goes on in the Reform camp quite a bit, but how do we evaluate technology? And medicine is a form, I think, of technology.
Absolutely.
One of the problems is, and pietism has brought this about, well, all technology is good, so embrace it all equally, and everything it does is good, and it makes life easier and better, and whatever. But it relates to something. We were at in Huntsville, Alabama. We were at the Saturn V Rocket Center. And Werner von Braun was a German who grew up in all this German Nazi craziness about medical experimentation and World War II, fled, came here, and you're in the Rocket Center, and they have these quotes on the wall, and it's Werner von Braun, and he says, man will be able to reach outer space, and in ascending into space, he will ascend God himself.
Wow.
I immediately thought, well, Babel.
Yep.
This is the Tower of Babel. So I think one of the things that we have to bake into our principles of how we handle technology, we evaluate medicine, we've got to realize that a lot of these things were created so that man could be Babelic, so that he could transcend the limits that God placed on him. And those limits were actually things that were for your good. Like a woman, her hormones and her cycle and all those things are a gift given to her for procreation.
Yeah, and they're like a marker, they're a marker of her whole body health.
Yes, and when you screw with those, and so it's just interesting to me that, like, how many pastors do you know that would even talk about hormones? But now you've got, like, men and women who are hormonal train wrecks, and we don't, as a church, like, if we're going to rebuild Christendom, we've got to have principles to evaluate medicine, health, et cetera, psychology, all of it.
Yeah, you have, I think, and it's interesting, you talk about technology, Christians evaluating technology. It's important for Christians to realize how much of the modern medical industry is related to this self-deification and like the desire to completely control our identity through what is essentially alchemy, chemical alchemy, witchcraft, magic, all of these kind of things.
Better living through chemistry.
Same thing. Most of our actual medical advance took place over 100 years ago in sanitation and surgery. We've had medical advance in surgical strategies and in sanitation and things like that, and antibiotics, really basic stuff that keep people from dying from stuff people just die really easily from in history. But a lot of our so-called medical advances since then, in the last 50 years, are absolute farces. They're just creating problems through our modern lifestyles that are a result of our psychological evolutionary selves.
10 years after they were introduced, most of them are proved to be false and kill you.
Yeah, a lot harmful than beneficial. Yeah.
Right. Iatrogenics is a real thing, which is that the medical industry actually ends up killing you by its interventions that were unnecessary. But a lot of our problems are actually the result of this worship believing this creed about man as psychological animal, sexual animal, killing ourselves in our lifestyles, killing ourselves in how we eat and in the world that we've made in chemical intervention. And all of a sudden cancers are exploding and autism is exploding and all these things are exploding. And then we intervene with more chemicals to treat symptoms that suppress symptoms but don't actually address root causes. And so what we're doing is we're actually poisoning ourselves in attempts to make ourselves gods. We need to move on, but do you guys have any response to that?
So I'll just say one principle that has been helpful for me is if something hasn't been around for 1,000 years, be highly suspicious.
Yeah.
Be highly suspicious. It's not to say old things are better necessarily. It's just they have more time to work out and see the fruit of them. Was there something you wanted to mention?
Yeah, I was actually just going to say, we've been talking about this. My wife's grandmother, this would be her great-grandma, not even knowing it. She lived sort of like the Weston A. Price life.
Yeah, she didn't have a label for it.
They grew up on a farm, they ate wild produce, and she had a garden, and she hated doctors and the medical establishment. And she was, I think, 103, and her son put her in a nursing home. She was in pretty good health. Put her in a nursing home. She died within 4 months.
Wow. Yeah, nursing homes is where people go.
Yeah,
die,
it's we're tired of you, go die.
Listen to the Bright Hearth podcast, Deathbed Hospitality.
Yes, exactly. But it made me think okay, compare that to what the medical establishment is promising today.
Yeah.
And it's really not, that is a way better picture of what health and what, God's creation and the things we've been given and all of that. So it's I would just ask people to genuinely question. It's so ingrained in our psyches that this is how life is. Is life really better? Because there's this idea that medicine and technology brought unending progress, but people are more miserable now than ever.
Yeah.
Over medication, this clinical identification with certain diseases or failures of your physicality and your mental well-being and things like that. As a pastor, I was thinking about it this whole conversation, and I think it is the most frustrating thing in ministry when you're doing counseling is to have someone start rattling off all of the diagnoses that they've received for all of the things that are wrong with them.
Like what?
All their therapeutic.
Yeah, all the therapeutic issues.
I have OCD, ACDC. I've got the Leonard Skinner.
Obsessive compulsive. I have this. I have that. And really, it boils down to there's usually a root sin that's identifiable to everyone except for the person because they can shrug it off.
I've had that in counseling too, Dan. One lady asked me, she said, is my husband a narcissist? Because she'd been to one shrink and they said, this is what narcissism is. I said, well, if you look at the definition of narcissism, that's just selfishness, just run-of-the-mill selfishness. Well, he's a narcissist because he only thinks about himself and he doesn't think about me and I should get rid of him because he's some sort of psychopath.
Yeah,
and you're
alcoholism. No, you're a drunk. It's there's all sorts of different
therapeutic medicalized world.
That's right.
Right. Let's add another layer here because if you take everything else and you basically put it into its distilled essence, you end up with, so we were talking about individual people expressing their sexual selves and their psychological selves, but what you end up with is actually number 6, the confession of our current Western idolatrous world is that the state is God, that man's problems are economic and political, that therefore the solutions to his problems will be solutions that come through deified man, through the state and economic solutions. So we've got, and really this goes along with last ones. We've got medical and interventional, medical and psychological intervention, therapeutic world. And then you add to that, well, man's problems, again, they're not my fault. They're not because I don't worship the true and living God and so I'm becoming like the idols I worship. No, it's actually that I'm being oppressed. And and we're coming full circle back to Rousseau now. Man's problems are economic.
And the state is going to alleviate all of them.
And the state's going to alleviate all of them. So, we've got Marx and Nietzsche again coming into play at this point. Marx, that class struggle is the problem. Economics are the problem. The oppression of the ruling class is the problem. Nietzsche, that life is a power struggle that we must overcome by rising up, transcending our nature, and becoming the Ubermensch, the overman. These are old ideas that are working themselves out, but really fundamentally, I think what you have, and this is from Joe Boot's Mission of God, his book, The Mission of God. He has a great section on how this happened, and his assertion is basically that there are only 2 options. There is Christianity, and particularly he points to the Christianity that is affirmed at the Council of Chalcedon in 451. You either have Chalcedonian Christianity or you end up with deified humanity expressed in statism. So do you guys see the link there? Do you see how those work together? How are those things connected?
Yeah, it's interesting. First of all, Brian, as you were saying all that, I was recalling a story R.C. Sproul told quite a while ago. But he said just before Francis Schaeffer died, he was sharing a cab with Francis Schaeffer. And he said, Francis, I just got to ask you the question, what is the greatest calamity? What is the greatest thing facing the church today? And he said it kind of surprised me because Francis Schaeffer, without skipping a beat, didn't wait a second. He said statism. So he was clearly aware that, like, Francis Schaeffer did a lot of work on, against evolution and all these things. But I think that he understood that the apex of all of it is the control of a Babelic, God state.
Right.
That brings you to this point. I'm interested, Brian. it's been a while since I read The Mission of God. I was actually going to ask you to unpack, like, what is Chalcedonian Christianity?
Sure, yeah. And this is Boots, and this is not me again. This is Joe Bootcamp. Brilliant guy.
Book. I would
Absolutely
highly
great book.
recommend this book.
He pointed out that Chalcedon 451, Council of Chalcedon, like much of the work of Christian theology through history, was took place because of controversy, where false teachers had come into the church and they were affirming, well, no, let's rethink the doctrine of Christ, let's rethink the doctrine of man. And there were teachers who were fiddling with basically the question of, is Christ God and man, or is Christ like Apollinarianism or Arianism or some of these other heresies where you have, like, for example, Apollinarianism is that essentially you have this human body, but his mind is really the divine mind that comes and inhabits the human body. Various stripes of Trinitarian and Christological heresy. Chalcedon affirmed against that. They read the scriptures and they went back and they said, no, this is what the church has always affirmed. They didn't invent it then. This is what the church has always affirmed. Christ is truly God and truly man. He is God with a truly human nature added. And so he has a human mind, like the Westminster Shorter Confession says that he added a rational soul, a human soul and a human body. So Christ isn't pretending to be a man. He isn't God inhabiting a meat puppet. He's truly man and truly God. And Joe Boot's point, I thought this was brilliant, is that what Chalcedon does, and really what Christ does and Chalcedon affirms, is he creates the only possible definitive link and decisive link between heaven and earth, between man and God. He, in Christ, is the only way that man can be united to God. Then when we are in Christ, we are being conformed to true humanity, and we are partaking in the divine nature, as Peter would say. I don't mean that in a heretical way, but in the way that Peter says. We are partakers of the divine nature. We get the inheritance. And so what statism and idolatry always does is it tries to make another link between heaven and earth by deifying just humanity, not the God-man, but just deifying man. And his point was even more, I think, brilliant than that. He said, not only do we do this in worshiping a human, but we do this by worshiping the greatest display of human ingenuity, like concentrated, like man writ large, which is what? The state, human government, human empire, human kings. This is Pharaoh, descended from the sun god, Ra. This is Caesar worship in the Roman Empire. This is North Korea, right? This is like anywhere you see the state being worshipped as God and the head of that state, the emperor, king, ruler, president, whatever, being worshipped as a God, you are seeing this idea that the state is God and man's problems are economic, political. The savior is going to be a God-man state.
So I don't mean to derail us too much, but one of the main criticisms or vein of criticisms that I've seen against postmillennialism is that it seems like the opponents of postmillennialism is assuming that Christians are saying our issue is political. Our issue is economic or technological or whatever it is.
Or just the law.
Or it's, yeah.
If we just had God's law.
If we just had God's law, I would fix it. Yeah, so theonomic, postmillennialists, they're saying that we're identifying the same issues as the statist. Are they right in that criticism or wrong?
They're completely wrong, and here's why. Because postmillennialism is nothing if it is not the idea that the Great Commission will be successful, which is not that a perfect law will fix us. No, read the Old Testament. They had the Mosaic Law, and it just provoked them to sin. What we need is new hearts. We need the gospel of the kingdom of God, saving and transforming sinners so they have hearts that actually want to obey God. So the law is downstream.
So the location of the issue is reversed.
Absolutely.
Or the solution, I mean.
Absolutely.
So the location where people, the statists would say the solution is power. If we get the right person in power,
Right.
the right number of congressmen, the right Senate, the right Supreme Court, that's why you see so much around the Supreme Court.
Yeah.
Because if we get the highest rule in the land, then they can enforce these solutions that will actually solve our economic and political issues.
This is Islamic.
Whereas the postmillennialists, whereas the Christian faith, because the Christian faith is post-mill, would say is that men's hearts need to be changed. Men need to be baptized. The nations need to be discipled and baptized, and men will elect for themselves godly rulers. They will want to be governed by the holy and living God. Whereas instead, the statist is saying, we need the savior of the state to enforce our will onto everybody else. That's the salute. That's the issue.
I think a lot of it is that, so this was the charge like levied against any Christian conservative, right? Was that you're just one of the Trump supporters. You think that Trump is going to save you. The real problem here is a lot of people actually do view Trump as like a savior complex. They're not Christians and they don't believe in regeneration. Mm-hmm. But that's not to say that many Christians who say, like, I voted for Trump, happy to say that, voted for Trump. I don't think he's a savior. I think the guy is kind of a moron in many senses of the word, but I like some of the things he was doing, maybe the best option. You can agree with that. It doesn't really matter. But my point is, we're not fundamentally saying, as Brian brings up, hey, let's just go control the state. We're going the opposite direction. We're saying, hey, let's preach the gospel.
Right.
It'll transform people's hearts. And oh, by the way, those transformed hearts, they care about every sphere of life.
It's bottom up, not top down.
Yes.
And in the meantime, if we can elect rulers that will enforce something closer to a Christian morality than not, of course we're going to do that and choose to do that because we love our neighbors and we want them to be ruled by something as close to the good standard as possible. Yeah. But we don't hope in that.
Yeah, love of neighbor.
We don't trust in horses and chariots. So guys, really all of this sums up to the last point in the confession. And this is really the summary of all of them. And it's that man is God. The idolatrous, demonic-infested land of Western culture today, at the pinnacle of their statement of faith is this belief that man is God. That God is dead, we killed him. But actually, it turns out he's resurrected in the form of us. Deified man will always see the quote-unquote death of God as a job opening, and they will apply, and they will say, oh, we have interviewed ourselves, and we got the job. So now we're God. Nature abhors a vacuum. So we've constructed this creed of the high places of our culture that we believe that you need put your hand to the plow of coming against. In the next episodes of The King's Hall, we'll be addressing in several episodes each of these elements of our culture, and we'll be bringing the solution to them. Not just what is the problem, but what is the new Christendom going to say over against the man as God, over against man as just a psychological, sexualized self who expresses himself, and that's his greatest end, just to express himself that the problem is psychological and we need therapeutic and medical answers. No, we're gonna unpack the biblical doctrines that actually give the solution and the problem correctly. The new Christendom is going to be built on the right answer. So thanks for listening to this episode of The King's Hall. In the next episodes, we're going to be diving deep on the elements of this creed and their high places and fleshing out a strategy for chopping them down in the spirit of Boniface. Before we go, and since I have the mic, gentlemen, let me encourage you to check out another podcast in our network, Bright Hearth, in which my wife, Brian, this is Brian talking, my wife and I are aiming to equip Christians to recover the lost arts of homemaking in the productive Christian household. It's a very blue-collar application of a lot of the theory and theology that we're unpacking in this show, and as such, I think it's a good companion to the work of this show. So thanks again for listening, and remember, Vincit quisa vincit, he conquers who conquers himself. Godspeed, and we will see you in the next episode of The King's Hall.